Thank you very much.
Cool. Thank you.
All right, I'm going to lead off with a teaser question. Tayloe, how would you describe Intuit's journey from the desktop to online software as a service?
Wow, that's a long journey. We started, I guess, about 30 years ago with Quicken as a desktop DOS application, and that went through evolution into Windows, and then we started to build other products, acquire other companies, and all of them we had to start with a desktop application and move it to being an online application, and then eventually mobile. So it's been quite a journey, which I'd love to dive into.
Yeah, feel free if you'd like to. Is there any key points you want to kickstart there? Or?
Yeah. So I guess one of the things that is that as we made our early foray into online products, we tried to build those with the same engineers who had built our desktop products. And as I'm sure all of you know, there are very different skills involved. And our first attempts were not brilliant. And so we had to really think about how we did it, what kinds of people, what kinds of skills we needed to pull that off. And I would say that several years ago, we hit a point where we had an outage that was just enough to wake us up and not enough to cause any real customer damage that made us rethink how we attack our online journey. And in the wake of that, we changed a whole bunch of things, including we realized we needed to bring in some fundamentally different skills than we'd had on board before. And so we brought on board a new raft of vice presidents and directors of engineering. They hired a number of people underneath to help us rejuvenate how we were, going after our online products. But then as we made our journey to mobile, and you should understand that an enormous amount of our customers' interactions with QuickBooks and with our tax products is actually through mobile devices. Mint, our personal finance tool, is mostly accessed through mobile. And I would say about half of the people, a little over half of the people who did their taxes with TurboTax this year, mobile was at least involved at some point in the preparation of their taxes. So we are full over to being a mobile-first company. And as we did that, we started to realize, hey, the people who were our desktop engineers were actually the perfect engineers to be building mobile because those skills turn out to be very translatable. If you think about it, you're building software for one device. You've got a distribution problem. You can't just put software up several times a day as you can on the web. And while everybody else in the Valley was scrambling to find mobile talent, we were awash in mobile talent by simply retraining the desktop engineers that we'd had of yore.
That's really interesting. You've got a great way of describing that, sort of from desktop to online done wrong to online done right, and then to cloud. Any commentary around that?
Yeah, it's what I would say is that at each juncture where you're changing technology, it's important to think about whether you have the skills to pull that off, whether you have people who can be retrained, or whether it's going to be a time when you've got to bring in some leavening, some outside people who can help you make that journey. And I would say in one of those cases, we really did have to do some outside hiring. We really did need to bring in that skill. We needed to rethink how we organized, and we needed to rethink our processes. And in the other case, we were able to retrain people that we already had on board to good advantage. And so I think the lesson from that for us was be mindful about which one of those situations you're in, because I don't think it's a good idea to advocate for when there are skills changes that are needed, that all the time you should change out people or all the time you should retrain people. I think the situation will determine which is the best way to go.
Fantastic. Any questions yet from the crowd?
Can you elaborate a little bit on how you
Well, I think if you look at the problem that you have when going to online, you're running things at much higher scale. The consequences of failure are much greater. Security is a more complicated problem because everything is available all the time to everybody. And so I think thinking about the data segregation, how do you protect your customers' data? How do you make sure that you have very small blast radius if a bad guy were able to get in? How do you make sure that you run systems at the scale that's required to, since all Americans seem to be procrastinators and file their taxes at the last minute, how do you scale up to make sure that every last person can actually file their taxes on time? There are complexities there that just don't exist on the desktop. And likewise, if you're building for a device that has a lot of sensors on it, that you can only distribute software to once every few weeks. You can't distribute software several times a day. Then there are different problems. And so thinking about what skills you have and whether they're cognate enough and retrainable enough, I think is important in that journey. I'd say also that as we've been recently starting to move a lot of our stuff to the public cloud. And I know there was a good raucous debate about that yesterday. We made the choice to move our stuff to public cloud for the primary reason of increasing developer speed. We wanted our developers to be able to deploy, hydrate, dehydrate, systems so that they could innovate faster, because we are at our core an innovative company. We've reinvented ourselves over the course of 30 years many, many times. And so we wanted to facilitate that innovation. It does parenthetically also help us with the more elastic of our applications that have enormous peaks and valleys, where tax is only one of the examples of those. And in our journey to the public cloud, you've got to even think about security even harder. So again, we consider ourselves as stewards of our customers' data. They give us some very private data to do their taxes, to do their accounting, as you might imagine. So one has to think through very, very carefully, if you're going to put something in an avowedly hostile environment, what are you going to do to protect your customers' data? So we've taken a lot of care and a lot of time to make sure that we beef up our security measures to allow for that.
Fantastic. Let's talk a little bit about business and technology drivers. What are some of your key business and technology drivers behind selecting the public cloud, especially the operating model itself?
Well, I say that, maybe going back a little bit to our journey from the desktop to online, when we were moving to online, each of our different business units operated fairly independently at that time and went out and chose their own hardware standards, their own software standards, and we ended up with a bit of a Tower of Babel. As we, so obviously one of the things that we had to do as we straightened ourselves out operationally is to get to standards, get to common places to host things and so forth. And it was a natural journey, as I mentioned before. If our desire is to out-innovate everybody who would be a would-be competitor, that we need to make an environment for our engineers to work the fastest that they possibly can and do the best work of their lives. And we felt that going to public cloud would allow for that kind of agility, so that, for example, when you need to spin up test environments, when you need to spin them down, you can do that, and it doesn't cost an arm and a leg, and you don't have to wait behind a deployment process to do that. So it really was driven by developer speed, fueling innovation speed, delighting our customers, fueling competitive advantage.
Customer delight.
Customer delight, absolutely.
You've hit on the people components. You've talked a little bit about the technology components. I'm going a little off script. Any thoughts around the process? Did you use a common IT process framework? How did you help solve some of the process problems?
That's a great question. As I mentioned, each of our business units at the dawn of the online age for us started out formulating their own processes. And so one of the things that we had to do was to get to a lot more standardization of how we did things, what were the architecture standards that we were going to deploy to make sure that we could deliver high availability and disaster recovery, how we could re-implement our applications so that they could be truly active, and it could be truly resilient to all kinds of different problems that could arise. And so we didn't follow a particular process from type, but we did actually have a whole bunch of meetings and regular reviews to drive everybody to our internal standards that we developed to drive that kind of high availability and disaster recovery in an environment where we still want to be able to release software freely, very, very quickly, so that we can respond to customers' needs, so we can watch what is performing well with customers and then make adjustments to that, and so that we can do deep technology innovation.
How was the recognition of the business value component of that? Did that work out the way you had expected? Did it end up a little differently? When you think about the transition to public cloud, there's an OpEx concerns, right? There's obviously capital benefits on the backside. Did things work out like you had planned? I'm not asking for specific numbers or anything, but just a genuine feel where how you set the plan and then how did the plan end up?
So I would say the most interesting part of that is sort of the trade-off between what the business people think they want in terms of product capability in the short versus what do you have to do to protect your customers. And when it comes to operating in the public cloud and you figured out how to secure everything quickly, then you can move with much greater speed and satisfy both constraints. But at the starting part of that, as you're beginning to make that journey, there is an upfront investment. And that upfront investment, of course, as in all of our companies, is a trade-off between immediate business goals of product capabilities that would enhance customer revenue, enhance customer stickiness. And so sometimes at the beginning of that journey, as I'm sure you did with a lot of your companies, we had to have some very interesting trade-off discussions about how much revenue we were going to give up in order to provide the right level of protection, speed, and uptime for our customers. We're well past that now, but those were interesting discussions. And I think it was good because everybody came to the table, everybody gave a little bit, and so we ended up with a compromise that I think made good sense from a customer standpoint, from a technology standpoint, and from a business standpoint.
That's pretty. That's, I think, very enlightening from a conversation perspective. It's very difficult, at least in my experience on the financial side, to get the executive teams together, right? Because there's fiefdoms that have been built over time. We're humans, right? We have emotional investment in the things that we're working on, and it can be difficult to move that needle. One of the questions I have related is how was that executive support around you and the transition, especially as you moved? I mean, it was a huge move from desktop just to online, as you said, done bad, then online done
well.
correctly, and then that's it. It's a huge spectrum. Most of us are never going to have that. We're just really talking about taking stuff that exists in our data center and just chucking it out into the cloud, right? You really had to evolve the apps, which is ultimately where we have to go to. So I'd love your thoughts on that, sort of the executive support and how they came together a little bit to tell that story.
Yeah, I think that we have a very collaborative culture as a company that helps encourage that. It is also, from an organizational perspective, all of the engineering is matrixed between me as the CTO and the general managers, plus a piece of it which is common across all of them, which reports solely to me. What that means is because those engineering VPs and SVPs report to both me and to one or more, and to some GM in many cases, we have to sit down and argue things out right now. Right, we can't wait till a couple years till the reorg and have one side just determine that decision. We have to sit down and argue those things out. And again, think that it's an aspect of our culture that makes that reasonable and easy to do in most cases. And I think we were able to find a reasonable middle ground in how to make the journey that we needed to make while satisfying our customers and satisfying our shareholders.
That is fabulous, fabulous insight. Questions from the audience? You're missing out on a great opportunity here. Please.
Yeah, during your decision process, how much do you leverage partners and vendors? Or is it all pretty much internal?
I think we're pretty agnostic about partners and vendors versus internal. We'll do whatever makes sense. And I think whenever it comes down to any interesting size engineering project, it will be a make versus buy decision that we'll make on how do we get it done. One of the things that is important when you think about these as durable products where we need to be able to innovate over the long haul, is that if we do a project with external people and they run away, and we haven't figured out how to retain that knowledge and figured out how to take that code base and move it forward to further delight our customers as their needs evolve and as our understanding of their needs evolve, as different possibilities become available, then you're kind of stuck. And so, even when we do have a set of principles that we use about what kind of work is partner work and what kind of work is done by core engineering, but one of those principles is you've got to have enough internal core engineering people involved in that team so that when the consultants go away, those people are able to take that software and move it forward and evolve it and innovate it into the future.
So I've heard a couple of build versus buy things, and when you relate that to IT talent, one of the things I think I heard you say earlier was, well, if we don't have it, we'll have to go get it. With the way things are evolving so quickly, is it easy to acquire the type of talent that you need to really bring you forward, or are you forced back into building it because it doesn't exist, or it doesn't exist in the quantity that you can consume it?
That is a great question. So some of the things that you do are ephemeral. It's a one-time hump you have to get over. So, for example, when you do a ERP upgrade, that's usually a one-time hump, and you're not going to do that again for several years. And so hiring highly qualified outside consultants to do that work makes a ton of sense. When is something that is ongoing, right, where you're trying to build the world's best tax program that takes something that's intrinsically complicated, annoying, emotional, and turn it into something that is simple, that keeps users calm, that enables them to just tell the story of their life. What happened during the year that has financial consequence that could have something to do with their taxes. Take pictures of things as much as possible, and then from that information compile the forms that need to be electronically filed to the government. That's a problem that exists every single year, right? And you've got to make it better every single year. You're going to have new insights every year. You're going to have different technologies you want to bring to bear to make that problem even simpler with machine learning, with AI. And so what that means is that for those kinds of projects, they have to be largely staffed by people that you're going to have a year from now, 2 years from now, 3 years from now, not consultants who are going to pack up in a year and go away. In order to accomplish that, what we've had to do is figure out what our story is, right? How it is that we are going to appeal to the best engineers so that they will come here and stay here. And I'd say one of the things that's kind of fun about Intuit is it's a bit of a sleeper company. It's got less of a sort of flashy external brand, and then a lot of people who come here actually realize, wow, there's a lot of cool stuff going on underneath the covers. And so the battle isn't keeping them once they get here. The battle is actually getting them to cross that boundary. And so we've had to actually sit down and figure out, well, what are we doing that is going to keep the best engineering minds engaged? What would attract them here? And then be able to tell that story cogently to everybody that we would like to hire. This is, as you would imagine, a very difficult hiring environment. We're ringed by Google. And there's a lot of other, really awesome places to work up and down the valley that are 5-10 minutes drive away. And so we have got to have a story that is cogent and that turns out to be more than true when they come on board as to what is the coolness of the stuff that they're going to do and how the intellectual challenge is there to keep them fully engaged.
Other questions?
Thanks. I'm Craig Montello, So one of the things I've heard about public cloud anecdotally is that over time, as we start getting used to it, as you start getting addicted to it, the cost adds up. I'm wondering if you're starting to see that, or if you think that could possibly be a problem.
That's a great question. It totally depends. And in our case, then we have some very elastic loads. So tax, as I mentioned already, has some very clear peaks, 3 different peaks during the course of the year. The first peak is when people get their W-2s. The second peak is the deadline, and the third peak is the extension filers, and the people who didn't make the deadline. And payroll has its peaks and valleys too. We have the third biggest payroll system in the U.S. It's the largest payroll system for small businesses. QuickBooks itself has its peaks and valleys. Personal finance has a high adoption rate after New Year's resolutions, and people have drained their personal coffers for Christmas and the holidays. And so we do have lots of peaks and valleys. And so being able to buy the VM hours that we actually need when we need them and dehydrate them when we don't need them is very, very helpful in keeping our costs under control. I'm sure you've all thought about using reserved instances to keep the costs under control. That's something that we're doing as well. So if you have a certain static load that's always going to be there, and the peaks and valleys are always above that, you can buy these as reserved instances, and that keeps the costs way down. And then one of the things that's really important is feeding the information on cost back to the operations teams who actually own it, because if you try to centrally manage that, you don't necessarily know what ought to be turned off and what ought to be still left running. But the teams who are the operations teams close to it, if they see what the dollars are that are flying by, if they see the meter every day, then they're going to be incented to manage that stuff and up and down so that you keep the costs under control.
You're really talking about the application operations teams too, right?
Oh yeah.
Service operations teams.
Yeah.
It's important. Additional questions? Question there?
Not every.
All right, security is top of mind for all tech executives. You talked about it a little bit already. In the world of public cloud, it's kind of a dangerous and scary place. How is Intuit thinking about security sort of in that context? little bit in more deeply, if you don't mind? And then more importantly, what are words of wisdom that you can share with us on things we should look out for, things that we should sort of look out for in the road?
Sure, great question. A couple of thoughts on that. Again, I'll go back to, we have some really amazing data that our customers have given us in order to do their accounting and to do their taxes. And it is our job, we consider ourselves the stewards of that data, and we have very clear data principles about protecting that data and how we're going to use it and how we're not going to use it and how we're going to make sure it gets used only for our customers' benefit. Yeah. And so again, when you move from an environment where you imagine that you have a nice tight perimeter around it, and you imagine that everything that's running in that data center is your own and friendly, and then you move it to an environment where you're running on the same physical hardware as a bunch of bad guys, then you really have to think about how you're going to actually protect that data. And so in the process of doing that, I'm not going to go into the details of how, but we have had to think about layered defense, about blast radius if somebody should get into some part of it to make sure they can't get into very much, and how we make sure that everything is protected in every state that it can possibly be in throughout the entire traffic or life cycle of the data. So that has taken a fair amount of upfront planning, as you might imagine. Getting a system set up that way does require a little bit of a barrier. But then the thing is, when you start to go back and think about your own data center, right, your private cloud, that whole idea of perimeter defense, I think, is becoming a little bit more permeable than we would like sometimes to believe. And thinking about, if you're operating in a hostile battlefield in your own data center and bringing back some of the technologies that you've developed for securing things in the cloud to provide better segregation, smaller blast radius, higher levels of encryption, more protection inside your own data center, that's the part of the journey we're on now for the stuff that we haven't yet moved to Amazon. So that forces you to up your game on security in a much more fine-grained way, and then the lessons learned from that we can bring back to our own data center as well, and are doing that now.
That's super exciting, right? Because today, many of us are challenged with solving these issues, these security challenges at the infrastructure layer, right? And in many ways, we always harp, the application has to have a stake in this game too.
Oh,
right?
yeah.
And the way you thought about it in aggregate, about setting up the data model ahead of time, understanding how that data is being handled at each phase, at every call inside the application, what you're sending, how you're protecting it, it gives you a very clear chain of thought and a chain of custody for how that data is handled inside of that application. And I think that is immeasurably good advice that we can take back and think through when we're going down those same paths.
Yeah, I see a poster over on the wall there saying full stack engineer. One of the things that as we started our journey, it was very much the data center people, and then there were the software application people, and ne'er the twain should meet, and they had some sort of abstract ideal interface between the two that of course isn't true, because the system that you think is a black box has certain performance characteristics, it has certain security characteristics, and if you as an architect or an engineer of application software don't actually understand that all the way down to the bottom, how it's going to perform badly under what circumstances, what you're doing you could substantially beef up security by what you do in the application layer, not just in the infrastructure layer. I think you're completely de-optimizing how well you can run your stuff. So one of the things that we do that I've been driving towards, and I think we've actually started to achieve quite well, is making sure that all of our architects are able to think entirely full stack, including the deployment architecture, what they're running on, how it's going to behave under what circumstances.
Please.
Are you concerned with being single vendor in public cloud, or are you looking at multi-vendor options there? If you are looking at multi-vendor, what are some of the tool sets that you might help prioritizing to give a common consumption model to ops and your development?
Yeah, I get that question a lot, and it sort of baffles me, because figuring out how to secure your applications in one cloud by itself is complicated enough, and trying to figure it out in 2 or 3, I think our brains would explode. So I want to liken this to a journey that happened several years ago. When I first joined the company, we were actually trying to do our virtualization with every virtualization vendor. And we'd built a layer that made it possible for you to be agnostic as to what your software is getting deployed on. Of course, that completely de-optimized for the advanced capabilities that some of the virtualization vendors had. at that point in time. And so it relegated everybody to lowest common denominator approach on what you could do with virtualization. So vMotion, things like that, no, couldn't do that. So when I came in, I said, gosh, guys, why don't we just go with the leading vendor, the one that has the most capabilities, because figuring out how to make your stuff run in a virtual environment, which, by the way, isn't very hard, is harder than switching virtualization vendors later if it turns out that the guy you picked turns out to be the wrong horse to be riding 2 or 3 years from now. So my belief is that by committing to a particular vendor and figuring out how to re-architect your applications so that they can be secure, can have deliver the uptime and the speed that's expected in a public cloud environment, that work is largely portable to the next guy. And I would rather spend the dollars in the future, if I have to port to another cloud vendor, because those are future cheaper dollars that are hypothetical that I may never have to spend, rather than spending all those dollars now to build compatibility and hampering all of the developers so that they can only use the least common denominator set of services for all the vendors that we decide to write on top of. So I would say that choosing a single vendor is helping us with speed in the short. It may be one we never have to switch off of, and if we do, then we can spend those dollars to do the porting in the future. But we'll do that on applications that have already been re-architected to operate, with high uptime, high security, high performance in a public cloud environment. So all the heavy lifting work will be done, and it'll be more micro tweaks that we have to do if we have to switch vendors.
That's a great piece of advice too, right? That sort of flies in the face of what conventional wisdom would sort of say, right? Which is, be prepared with a secondary vendor, avoid lock-in, et cetera. But it's a very compelling case when you start thinking about the fact that the restrictions on the developers, the fact that you'd have to spend money now instead of hypothetical dollars in the future, right? That is a very, very compelling argument to that story. I think we might have another great debate topic in our future. So I'd love to ask more of a personal question. We all have our journey that we've gotten to get us to this point, right? Looking back through the positions you've had over time, is there any experiences that you went through at any of your companies that helped prepare your mindset for the transition that was going to happen here at Intuit? Is there anything that kind of helped you start thinking in a way that was different, that enabled that transition here?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we all follow different and circuitous paths in our careers. And I'm guessing there's not too many people in the room who are doing what they set out to do at the beginning of their career. I think many of us are not sure what they want to do next. I've always been dead sure what I wanted to do next and always dead wrong. I started out believing I wanted to do research. I came out to the West Coast to work at Xerox PARC for several years in its heyday. Realized research wasn't for me, especially if they didn't have a path to market. Went to work at Sun Microsystems, which actually was on this campus many years ago. Then from there I went to Borland to work on the languages tools there. So workstation stuff, PC stuff. Came back, got recruited back to Xerox. I didn't learn the first time. Ended up running a business unit there, their software business unit. And then went to join a startup, and then I worked at Ariba for many years, so in the B2B space. I worked at VMware for a little while, and then I came here. So varied experience, desktop, workstation, online, and of course now mobile is the dominant, but mobile backed, of course, with really, really rich services running in a data center is the dominant thing. And so I don't know, I would say that each of those experiences has turned out to be useful in how I think about customers, software, uptime, operability, and each of them have contributed, I think.
That's totally fair. Thank you very much for that insight. So do we have any final questions? We're just about out of time. All right. Yep, one more. Go ahead.
Sorry, back to the vendor question. Going with a single vendor, have you seen an increase in service quality from that vendor? And did you get the opportunity to leverage the power just going with a single vendor to influence their product?
Yes. absolutely. So I would say we have a great relationship with our vendor. We meet with them once a quarter to go over, what are the things that we'd like to see in their roadmap. All of those are around security. And, we push them pretty hard on security. A lot of the things that we're asking for are things that they end up hearing, 6, 12 months later from other enterprise class customers. And so they've actually learned to view us as a bit of the canary in the coal mine. If we're whining about wanting some security feature, they're now taking that quite seriously, and we find those things being addressed in their roadmap, pretty quickly. So that's one of those things that's harder to do, again, if you're playing 3 different vendors versus having a very good relationship at a senior level with the right, concrete messages going in about what it is that you need, what's the logic for why, what problems you're trying to solve, and why these problems are cognate to not just you, but a whole bunch of other enterprise customers that are going to hit exactly the same problem, sooner or later. So it does behoove them to get after those things.
All right. Tayloe, thank you very much. This was absolutely fantastic.
Thank you.